Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming. Really appreciate it. And I want to thank Russell Gold for being here. My name is Jason Bordoff. I'm a professor here at the School of International Public Affairs and director of the Center on Global Energy Policy. Russell Gold, many of you may not know in person, but hopefully you've seen his work. For someone like me who spends a lot of time talking to reporters and journalists, it's really fun to talk to those from whom you probably learn more by talking to them than maybe they learn by talking to you. And Russell's really one of the best out there in terms of covering the energy sector and how thoughtful he is in the work that he does. So he's the senior energy reporter for the Wall Street Journal. He's based in Texas, responsible for covering really all assets of the global energy picture, particularly focusing on the revolution we've seen with unconventional shale gas and tight oil development over the last several years. Was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, winner of a Gerald Loeb Award for Distinguished Business and Financial Journalism for their coverage of the Deepwater Horizon blowout. And most importantly, is an alum of Columbia University, graduating just about 20 years ago, just over 20 years ago.
No comment.
With a degree in history. And most recently has written this really fantastic book, The Boom, that for people who are interested in understanding better what this is all about, that we've been talking about now for several years, and you can't really have a conversation about energy at all without talking about what's happened in the U.S. unconventional oil and gas space and how dramatically the U.S. production outlook has really flipped on its head, and really laying out the history of it and what it means. But so I really would encourage people to read it. It's really well done. And but before I get there, just to start, I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then we'll sort of open up to a conversation. We have a microphone that will pass around the room, but we'd be interested to hear you're from Philadelphia. You came to university in the middle of New York City. You studied history,
right,
and now you roam around wells in Texas. How did this happen? How did you come to why this as your focus and your work and the amount of time it takes to produce something like this?
Well, as with many things in life, it was utterly and completely random. I thought about going going to school and getting a master's and a PhD in history and really studying that, and I thought, well, I'll try journalism for a little while and see how that takes. And, that was 21 years ago. No, I ended up going down to Texas because I had been working on the East Coast. And the sort of the route, you could take a long time in the East Coast to kind of work your way up. And someone told me about a job in San Antonio. And I thought, well, it sounds like a foreign posting to me, from the East Coast. Go down to San Antonio. So I went down there, and I haven't managed to leave Texas yet. And so I figured if I was living in Texas, I might as well cover the oil and gas industry because that's really what's the most interesting and exciting. And, it took me around the world to 5 continents. And then as it turned out, the most interesting story in the energy world was actually going on here in the United States, which was a nice benefit. So I started tracking it and covering it.
So we'll get into the specifics of the book, but just to give the broad contours for people who haven't read it, I think it came out today. Is today the first day it's
today
out?
Is pub day,
Many
yes.
people probably haven't seen it yet. But you could approach this issue from lots of different angles. Talk a little bit about what you thought was most interesting and where you decided to kind of go deep with a book-length treatment of the issue.
Right. Well, to me, the really interesting question was we were clearly going through a revolution in the United States in energy. We were creating energy in different ways, and the old order, lots of coal, 50-60% coal, was crumbling. There was no question about that. So to me, the interesting question was, okay, if we're going through that, what does this mean? I mean, how are we balancing these trade-offs between creating jobs and cheap energy and the environment? And are we going to end up at a place that's better than where we started? And that, to me, was the most interesting question because as I saw, as a Wall Street Journal reporter, you tend to cover the story from a business perspective, from the companies. And, you can watch some of these companies that came out of nowhere and suddenly were $20 billion companies. And, I'm thinking of a company like Chesapeake, which went from literally no one was paying any attention to it it was drilling more wells than any other company in the world by 2009, 2010 or so. And so you look at these companies, you realize, well, they're not asking those questions. They're chasing those every 90 days growth and meeting Wall Street requirements. So I wanted to step back and say, okay, what they're doing is really remarkable. They're creating something. But are we finding the right balance? And do do people have the right information to even ask the right questions? And so I figured, well, let's put it out there and let's try to have some of that conversation, because we are really, when this revolution is over in 10 years and 5 years and 15 or 20 years, we're either going to look back and say, wow, we did something amazing during this period as a country and ultimately as a world, or we're going to look back and say, we really blew that opportunity. And, anytime you have that kind of dichotomy, you want to try to encourage people to get it right.
And blowing that opportunity would mean what? When you say blow that opportunity, you mean we wouldn't extract the resources we can, we would destroy the environment in doing it, we would...
Destroy the environment would definitely be one of them. We have this abundance of energy in the United States right now, and we're also clearly in the middle of an energy transition. Last week I was out in California at a conference, and we had several utility CEOs and a solar CEO. Everyone agreed, and a coal CEO, even the coal CEO, Peabody Energy, agreed that we're in the middle of an energy transition right now, and that the world as we know it, the energy world, will be radically different in 10 or 15 years. We can emerge on the other end of this with an energy world that I think we all can be a lot happier with. Low carbon, affordable, abundant, et cetera. Or we can end up having just used this newly discovered oil and gas and use it all, and in 15 or 20 years, we're right back to where we were. So that's really what I see as the opportunity to affect this transition in a way that's relatively painless and to get to a place where we want to be.
So can you talk a little bit more about what those impacts are? I mean, how big a deal is this? There are some people who think, well, we're going to see this boom, but the decline rates are steep. This will be gone in a couple of years. Not that big a deal. Other people think,
totally
economically, this is the biggest thing that's happened to the U.S. economy in a long time, and maybe that gets exaggerated.
Beware of hyperbole. Yes,
exactly. So well, let's start with the economics.
This is not the biggest thing that's happened in the economy in 20 years. This is a nice boost during a period where we have a high level of unemployment, and it's been able to absorb a lot of those unemployment. The economic benefit, frankly, would be a lot different if this were going on a period of full employment or low unemployment. So the first thing to realize is this has helped a lot, primarily because we had a lot of people who are unemployed. That effect will eventually go away. This is not transformative. This is not a second Silicon Revolution where all of a sudden we're going to be doing everything more efficiently. We're taking one form of energy and replacing it with another form of energy. So it's not fundamentally changing the economy. So don't believe the hyperbole. It will go away. And remind me of the first part of your question again. We were talking a little bit about the economy, but
and the other impacts too. I mean, it'd be helpful to hear what you thought and then.
The supply question. You had asked me about how long does this last.
Yeah.
I'm a firm believer. Look, I have both studied the oil and gas industry up front, but also if you look back at places like Bakersfield, California, and Kern River. I mean, this was a 100-plus-year-old oil field at this point, and they keep coming up with new technology to get a little bit more oil out, a little bit more oil out. I mean, this is an oil field that should have been dead and gone 50 years ago, and it's still going. I think the same thing's going to happen with shale. When you talk about fracking, they're swinging a blunt instrument, basically. They don't know what's going on. I mean, you talk to these engineers, you say, well, how exactly does this work? Well, we don't really know, but it works. It's really kind of amazing that we've got this, we're changing the whole world and the U.S. economy. We really don't know what's going on. Once you've built the pads and the pipelines, once you've sunk all that cost in, there's an incredible incentive to see if you can get a little bit more oil and gas out of these rocks. Right now, maybe 5, maybe at the best 10% recovery. So if you think that there are 10 barrels of oil in each section of rock, right now we're only getting 1 barrel out. They will find ways to go back and get the next barrel, and then they'll find ways to go back and get the next barrel. I think there's plenty of supply. The more interesting question is demand and what you do with it. Where does this all go? And what does it affect? Because we could turn around and just export it all. Change the law, start exporting crude oil. We can export lots of gas if we wanted to. We could use it to generate jobs. We could use it to transform the economy. We could use it to support renewable growth. I mean, there are lots of different things you can do with it. So that, to me, the more interesting question is the demand side than the supply side. There's going to be oil and gas out there. In fact, there's going to be so much oil and gas out there that if we burn it all, we're going to be in trouble in terms of climate change. So now would be a good time to sort of think about how can we use that to affect this transition.
So yeah, you brought up climate change, and you sort of on the environment. So this shifting from economics to the environment, you've heard claims that this has been a positive for the environment because we've seen coal to gas switching, greenhouse gas emissions are down. From an air quality standpoint, local pollution, gas can be better than coal. And then on the flip side, we're contaminating water, we're causing earthquakes, we're all these. So how do you think about the trade-offs there, and is there hyperbole there, and where is it?
That's a great question. Look, there's no question. We're here in New York City. New York City's air is cleaner than it has been in several decades because of coal plants being shut down and natural gas plants coming in. So local air quality has made a huge difference.
And less home heating oil, number 6 fuel oil.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Very good point. It emits less greenhouse gases when you burn it to make the same amount of electricity than coal does. So it is, from that perspective, it's clearly beneficial. There are some questions out there. Natural gas is methane. Methane, I think it's like 80 to 95% of what natural gas is. If that leaks out, it's a very potent greenhouse gas. So that is a clear issue that needs to be addressed. You have to stop methane leakage. So from the big picture, it's a net benefit. It's a very big benefit for the environment. It's an industrial activity. There are spills. It is causing earthquakes. That's been established. Well, fracking doesn't cause earthquakes. Disposing of the wastewater causes earthquakes. That's an important distinction, just because if you want to fix the problem, you need to know what the problem is. Water, I think water is a much more mixed bag. We have been involved in endless arguments and lawsuits about how much water has been damaged by oil and gas drilling. One of the things, I wrote an article that ran this weekend, and I said, here's a common sense solution. Every new well that's drilled in the United States, let's do baseline water testing, let's do baseline air testing. That way we know what was the quality of water before industrial activity started. When you go to a place like Dimock, Pennsylvania, which has been the poster child of water contamination, there are people pointing fingers right and left saying, well, you did this, no, I didn't, it was naturally occurring, da-da-da. It's really difficult to get to the bottom of that. There's the old Willie Sutton quote. I think it was Willie Sutton, right? Why did you rob banks? That's where the money was, right? Well, why do you drill in these places? That's where the gas is. And there's been gas there for a millennia, and that gas has leaked up over time. You go to places in South Texas, and you talk to the old timers, and they say, oh yeah, as kids, we used to put, we'd have natural gas seeps. We used to grab them in a paper bag, in plastic bags or in bags, and we'd light them on fire. It was fun to do. Natural gas leaks up. It does that naturally. Does that mean that the industry doesn't help it? Sure it does. When you drill a well, you're creating a superhighway through geologic time. If you don't build that well properly, you've just given all that methane that would have leaked up over the next few millennia, and it's on the express lane up there. So you really absolutely need to build wells right. That is a critical issue, and I don't think the industry pays enough attention to it. In the book, I write about cementing, how you have to get cementing wells right. And at first you might think, well, what are you talking about cementing? But it was a failure of cementing that caused the Deepwater Horizon to blow out. You need to get your cementing right. You put cement around the outside of the well. It needs to set and harden. If you don't do that right, you're going to have leaks. You're going to have methane coming up the outside of the well and looking for areas it can go to. And one of the best areas, the low pressure areas, is going to be the aquifers. And you're going to have methane build up in the aquifers. We need to get that right. But the good news is, if you look around Pennsylvania, North Dakota, and other places, where are these aquifers that are ruined? There hasn't been that many incidents of them. This is a very political issue. It can be very difficult to get a straight answer, but we are not seeing wholesale destruction of groundwater. I think there's been a lot of hyperbole on that.
So that's why I wanted to ask, when you said, the industry can do a better job with proper well construction and everything else. And 4 or 5 years ago, and we started having this national conversation about shale gas and oil development. It was more speculative. It was like,
right,
we can't do this; it's going to destroy the water. And now we've had several years of tens of thousands of wells being drilled a year.
Right.
What do we know or not know? Are we in broad brush contaminating water supplies, or is that really a rare exception? Or do we not know?
We don't fully know yet. There's been some very good peer-reviewed scientific work that have come out literally in the last 12 to 18 months that have been looking at this question. And by and large, what they say is there seems to be a correlation in some places that there are higher methane levels closer to newly drilled wells. So there is some evidence that there's some leakage. It is not overwhelmingly, there's not an overwhelming correlation, and it's not, the numbers are not enormous, but there does seem, at least in Pennsylvania where a lot of this is being done, some work on this. One of the things I say in the book, and I find this an incredible shame, is that we are 10 years into this, into the boom. You're right, the national conversation started 4 or 5 years ago. This really started, we started combining the technologies of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling in about 2003 or so. So we're almost 11 years into this. And it really has only been the last year or two that we sat down to ask these fundamental questions. What is the methane leakage? And is it contributing to climate change? How much water contamination is there? That is very late in the game to be asking these questions. I'm really glad these questions are being asked. We're doing some very good fundamental science work right now, and it's pointing to solutions and to fixes we hadn't even considered. But it would have also been nice to have done it in 2006 or 2007, just when this was all getting going. That way you wouldn't have had, as you point, tens of thousands of wells that maybe were built not quite as well as they should have.
So given how much uncertainty there is in what we don't know, we've seen very different regulatory approaches in the face of uncertainty.
Right.
Not just in your home state versus your school state. Let's say New York versus Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania kind of move quickly, and then the
Right.
regulation will catch up. New York, let's not really move at all until we feel like everything's nailed down totally. And the same, maybe you can compare U.S. and Europe, where not all of Europe, but several countries have said, we're not going to move at all until we really know what's going on, versus in the U.S. it's kind of moved very quickly, and we let the regulation hopefully catch up. Do you have thoughts on
Sure.
There are trade-offs and benefits, there are environmental risks and economic benefits. Like, who's
New York's
getting
sort
this
of
right?
taken the European approach, right? The Europeans basically say, we're not going to do anything new and untested until we've done a full case study to make sure we've tested it and do it right. The U.S. is more just like, well, let's go do it and we'll fix the problems later. Obviously, the European approach is much more cautious. But I also firmly believe that we wouldn't have had the benefits of this energy boom, the relatively inexpensive energy, the just finding all this new energy. And let's face it, as in the United States, this is a society built on fossil fuel. We absolutely need fossil fuel right now. We cannot snap our fingers and change off of it anytime soon. We would not have had the discoveries if it weren't for a culture in the United States which basically said, just go and do it, and we'll fix it later. So that's sort of the American way. I hear some chuckling out there, but it's true. This is the American way. You just go and do it, and then you fix it later. And that's sort of where we are right now. We've made the discoveries. The entrepreneurs that have taken the risks have been rewarded amply, and some of them went and squandered the money. I think we're well past the appropriate time to say, all right, we've made this discovery. We've, the benefits of the American approach have been realized by the entrepreneurs. Now, what do we do? How do we properly regulate it? Which is really the question that Europe's asking and New York's asking. How can we do this safely? I actually personally have more faith that the Colorados of the world, which are very engaged with this question, the Pennsylvanias of the world, will end up having a better regulatory regime than New York, because they've been there, they've been involved. And I highlight in my book this small town north of Fort Worth that has been living with this for 10 years, Bartonville, Texas. And, I was really impressed because they wanted to be part of the solution. They wanted to let people drill there, because most of the people who lived there owned oil and gas or owned the mineral rights, so they were going to benefit from it. But they kept asking this question. They would set they would come out with an ordinance, a set of rules, and they realized, well, we need to fix this and update this, and they would kept going through iteration after iteration after iteration for 10 years. And a number of cities north of Fort Worth did this. And in the end, I look at their rules and I say, I think they've got it right. They control when you can frack. They require sound walls and all sorts of, limit the number of trucks that come in and out, which is a major complaint for people who live in oil and gas zones. And I think right now that the states and the localities we should be looking at to figure out how to do it right are those ones that have been very engaged with it. New York is dithering, and God knows when the moratorium ends. I think New York needs to. There's a little hypocrisy that it's enjoying the benefits of this oil and gas boom in terms of the cleaner air, but yet won't participate. That's something that the United States has done for years. We have exported all the problems associated with oil and gas drilling to West Africa, to other places around the world, and we enjoyed the benefits of it. We per capita, we've used more oil and gas than any other major industrialized nation. I think Iceland beats us because they've got so much. Well, I'm not sure why Iceland is, but I think Iceland beats us because they've got all that geothermal. They shouldn't need oil and gas, but they do. And now we have an opportunity to bring that back to the United States, to bring the production back. And it's uncomfortable because we're sort of faced to confront, oh, well, this is kind of a messy business. You look at a place like the Niger Delta, which has been the source of, I did a rough calculation of about $1 trillion worth of oil imports in the United States over the last few decades. Huge amounts of wealth. So where is it all? Is the society better? No, it's a very corrupt place. The standard of livings are very low, and environmentally, the Niger Delta is a disaster. So that's been the source of our oil. Now the source of our oil is North Dakota. Are there going to be problems? Yeah. But I have a lot more faith that we will figure out how to get it right in North Dakota than we did in Nigeria because we're more engaged, because there are people who are, are the regulators going to do it right out of the box in North Dakota? No, they're not. They're allowing too much flaring, for one example. But I think, this is sort of like the local food movement, right? We all like our local food because we're producing it nearby and so we're more comfortable and it's not being done by factory farms, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's sort of what we're doing with oil and gas right now. We're bringing it back into our backyard. We're doing it in places that we're engaged with. And I think we're going to end up doing it a lot better and doing it in a way that we can be more comfortable with. It's not, well, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. You had talked a lot about which states are getting it right and whatnot. You talked about state regulation, and industry will tell you that's where regulation should be. Do you agree, and what do you think the right role for federal regulation is?
Yeah, I think the federal government, there are two things I think the federal government could and should do. First of all, establish a basement regulation. All regulation needs to be better than this. This is the minimum that people should have. We see that, we see it in a number of regulatory areas. The federal government's going to be requiring green completions, which is basically a way to complete the well. Once you drill the well, then you complete it, which is where the fracking takes place, to capture more of the carcinogens and the methane and et cetera, so you're not putting it out into the air. They're going to require that for wells. That seems like an eminently reasonable rule. Fine, let the states craft their own particular sets of regulations as long as they are as strong or stronger than what the federal government. But I think there's another area where the federal government could lend a very important example. After the Deepwater Horizon, one of the big problems in the with the way the U.S. government handled offshore oil and gas drilling is that they had the regulator housed in the same agency as the watchdog was in the same agency as the people who were charged with leasing all these offshore and generating tax revenue. So you had the watchdog and the cheerleader under the same roof. And one of the things they did is they broke that in two and said, we cannot do that. That does not work. Well, Texas still does it. North Dakota still does it. A lot of the states still do that. So it would be reasonable if the federal government, by example, would show that this doesn't really work very well and you're not going to have a good outcome, because what's going to happen is that the cheerleader is going to win out over the regulator and you're going to have weak regulations. And if there's one thing that could really hurt hurt this oil and gas boom and make it have just really outcomes that nobody is happy with, it's going to be weak regulations.
One of the things you hear federal officials say from time to time is it was federal R&D in the 70s that kind of made this all possible, and it wouldn't have happened without that support. Is
True. There's some truth to that.
Yeah.
Like with anything else. For this book, I went back and researched this, and there was an incredible amount of early blue sky research funded through the Department of Energy into shales, into fracking, this early form of fracking, even into horizontal wells. All of the basic technologies that made this together were being funded by Department of Energy research and grants. But the fascinating thing, or depends how you come down on it, but they had such a small budget that they could really do only 1 or 2 wells a year. which was not enough. So they would do 1 or 2 wells, they blow their budget, have to wait till the next year. So that's why it took so long. But then ultimately what happened was some of it transitioned over to something called the Gas Research Institute, which is sort of a public-private group. And George Mitchell, Mitchell Energy, who sort of the father of modern fracking, where modern fracking was invented, was in Mitchell Energy, picks up on this. He was on the board. He knew all this was going on. Looking back now, you can see all of the breadcrumbs, all of the basic research were coming out of there. It's just picked up by some of the private companies like Mitchell Energy.
And you talked about how the U.S. is different from a regulatory standpoint.
Yes.
You also hear people say, this probably wouldn't have happened anywhere else in the world, potentially, for a variety of reasons, which I want you to talk about.
Absolutely, yeah.
Do you agree with that? And what does that mean for the prospect of unconventional oil and gas development happening outside the U.S.?
No, I do agree with that. I mean, there are several reasons it happens here in the U.S. and not overseas. One, we have drilled a lot more wells than anyone else in the world. We understand the geology, having drilled those wells much better. Two, we have the service companies, the rigs, the pumps here in the U.S. You don't have them. But the really most important reason is that we have private ownership of the mineral rights. Most landowners, not all, most landowners own their mineral rights. So that when a company comes and says, we want to drill and frack on your land, they're often coming with a check for $10,000 an acre, $5,000, $20,000, depends on where you are and how frothy the market is at that point. It's a huge incentive. When you go overseas, almost every country in the world, there may be 1 or 2 exceptions, the mineral rights are held by the state, sort of comes out of the old British common law idea. And so you go to a place like Poland, where there's been a lot of enthusiasm, or South Africa, about the shales there. And the governments have not been able to find a way to incentivize communities to allow fracking to come in. The communities say, well, you're offering to build us a school in exchange for trucks and this and that. And, the United Kingdom, there's been controversies. That incentive that private ownership of the mineral rights in the United States created accounts for the fast growth, for good or for ill. So will we see shale development outside of the country? Absolutely. The United States right now is the envy of the Western world for its inexpensive fuel. Europe would love to be us. So there are going to be policies to try to get Europe to where we are. China would love to have some of this gas. I mean, if you look at all the political problems that pollution is causing in China, they would love to have more natural gas versus coal. But it's very difficult because this comes down to a local issue of how do you create the right incentives so that local communities are like, okay, we agree to this. In China, there have been blockades. In the United Kingdom also, blocking the rigs coming in because they don't see any benefit for them.
We've been talking about some high-level policy questions, but there's also some great color and stories in here, and I just want you to tell some of them.
I'm not a policy guy, really. I'm a storyteller.
Well, and you talk, for example, about being on site during a frack and the actually challenge of getting permission to even do that. And I think it was Marathon that you ultimately did it with. Many people here haven't been on a drill rig site. So just talk a little bit about what you saw, what it feels like. The people might not think of a control room at a frack site as
I'd be happy to.
NASA control center. Well, talk a little bit about it.
I will do that, and I should, before I do that, the number of firsthand accounts of what it's like to frack, to be there, are tiny. I was trying to think of this. Actually, we ran an extra of the book today in the Wall Street Journal, and then yesterday we were trying to figure out what the intro was going to be, and they said, well, should call this exclusive access. I said, well, it's probably not exclusive, but to be honest with you, I cannot think of anyone else who's really written about what it feels and smells and sounds like to be on a frack crew. So, considering how important that is, the industry would do better to let more people in so that there's more comfort. This had to go all the way up to the CEO of a major Fortune 500 company to sign off on this. So I was out at a place called Killdeer, North Dakota. Lovely name. And I was supposed to go out one night, but there were literally near hurricane strength winds. It was 70 miles an hour. I think a hurricane starts at 80 miles an hour. 70 mile per hour winds whipping across the prairie. So they couldn't lay the final pipes. And I was going to go to sleep for a few hours. We're going to try again at midnight. And I get the call and they said, okay, the winds have died down. Get out there. So I get out there. It's the first thing you go through is a safety meeting. And don't think for a second that this was done for my benefit. Safety meetings are really important because this is a very dangerous activity. In fact, we just had a fatality in either Eastern Ohio or Western Pennsylvania, it's a couple days ago. Fatalities do happen. This is so we had the safety meeting, and he taught, so this guy, Josh Byington, who I have in the book, talks to all the guys and says, look, this is what's going to happen. Be careful. Talk to the crew you're replacing. Know what's going on. So there's this hierarchy then. If you've been working in the industry for a while, you get to go into the data van, and it's comfortable, and it's air conditioned, or in this case heated because it was quite cold outside. And they've got a radio connected to the wall. It looks like a car radio, and they were playing Pink Floyd one night and Ted Nugent the next. And if you're not as experienced, you stand outside for 12 hours in 50-mile-per-hour wind in the middle of the night in North Dakota in October. Could be worse, but it was cold out there. Outside, so first of all, you have to imagine they come into the middle of the prairie or in the middle of Pennsylvania or wherever, you knock down all the trees and you create a flat acre and a half pad. And to do a frack, you need a lot of water. So you typically line up dozens and dozens, probably 60 to 100 tractor trailer size vats of water. So it almost creates a wall around the outside. And you've got pipes because you don't want to hook each one up. So there are pipes connected to each one so they can draw. Then you've got several big sand trucks because you also use sand in fracking. Because once you create the fractures in the earth, you use little spherical sand to keep them propped open. So you've got all these sand trucks, and you've got conveyor belts, and it's mixing it all together. And then you've got the chemical truck because they're chemicals. I mean, let's not mince words. This is 99. I pointed out at one point that your average frack is 99.5% water and this thing called guar and sand. Guar is just like a bean from India, basically. It's only 0.0, the industry would love to tell you it's only 0.05% chemicals. Well, that's true. But when you're talking about 5 billion gallons, that 0.05 ends up being quite a lot of chemicals. So you have these big vats of chemicals. And I can tell you, having gone in there, it was a sickly sweet smell in the chemical. So then we go into they mix up the chemicals, and they want to make sure they got it exactly right before they put it all down. So we go in there, and we introduce this guy, and it looked like sort of this kind of this was before I was watching Breaking Bad, but come to think of it, it kind of looked like the van for Breaking Bad, where they mixed up all the methamphetamines. It was like all these mixing things, and and a couple of young guys there. Wasn't no Walter White, but what was it? Jesse? Jesse was there. So this is a guy who's maybe 21 years old. So he starts mixing up to show us how that they were testing the first batch that was getting ready to go in to make sure it had the right chemical constituency. And he pours this in. It wasn't quite warm enough, so he puts it. So he puts a couple drops of something that was marked, I forget, like it was impossible. It was BR22 or something like that. And I said, well, what's that? Oh, I don't know. Well, I said, okay, well, let's take a look at the MSDS sheets, which are these material safety data sheets, which are supposed to be anywhere using chemicals. So, of course, they have no idea where they are. They finally drag them out, and the explanation, it was just a horrible explanation. It didn't explain what it was. So, this was a guy who was working with chemicals, didn't know exactly what they were, maybe a little uncomfortable, but he was following the rules. And he mixed up, so if you're of my age, this will make sense to you, but there used to be a toy in the 1970s called slime. And you would pour it in your hand, and it would kind of go out of your hand. It was this gooey stuff, and it wouldn't quite stick to you and wouldn't quite move fast. That's really what they're making. This is slime plus chemicals, because all slime is guar plus water. And that's your basic building block of what you use in fracking. So they mixed it all together, and I ended up looking to find out all the different chemicals they use, because Marathon Oil is one of the companies that does disclose later on what all the chemicals are. So I had the benefit of several weeks later looking, and it was, they use biocides and lubricants and some stuff that you would not want to work with. So you have to imagine this complex assembly. It's like a movable factory that they've set up there in the prairie with water and sand and chemicals, and just, you can't walk around without looking down because there are pipes everywhere. You'll trip on something. But then you go into the data van, and it's quiet. And, for my sake, they didn't put on the music, but, I wouldn't have minded if they had put on Pink Floyd. But, and they have just computers everywhere, everything. And they have what they call a program, 40 pages sent to them from Houston. And it tells them what to do to a T. And as one of them said, if you make one or two small mix-ups, you won't have a job. You won't be there next time around. And so they start executing it. And it's okay. They have these balls, because the way they built, this is actually kind of interesting, the way they built this very long well, a few years ago, they did what they called Hail Mary fracks, where they would just pour water in and just hope it created a frack somewhere. And then they realized, well, actually, it makes more sense. If you can figure out a way, we built this 2-mile-long horizontal leg, but let's break it up into 200 feet sections. So they have this complex system where they have baffles and balls, and if you drop the right size ball in, it opens up in a specific area, and you're going to put the water there, and once you've created the frack there, you drop the next ball, and it closes that section off and opens up the next section. So it's this massively complex operation, and it goes on 24 hours. One shift leaves and the next shift shows up. And these are people who are working 7 days on, 7 days off, basically. So you're working 12 hours, then you go home or you go to a man camp generally, which is just a big area where they've got a cafeteria and they've got, it's like a hotel, 1-floor hotel they've laid out. And then they come back and do it again, and they just do it again and again. And, these are not, you mentioned NASA. It felt like a NASA control center, except instead of everyone being kind of white coats with crew cuts, they all had these long hair and mustaches and beards and stuff. And at first I thought, well, that's just sort of the style, it's kind of the rugged outdoors. But, when I asked them, they said, well, the area is boomed so much that you can't really get a haircut. So, that was just a luxury that couldn't be afforded. So they all had, this great flowing hair. So it was sort of NASCAR meets NASA.
It is a very high-tech operation. That was one thing that sort of struck me the first time I remember seeing it. And and this took the whole thing, just so people know,
yes,
10 days, 14 days to frack a well, the whole process.
Well, okay. To frack it itself might take 30 hours, but to build it, about 2 weeks.
And that's being done tens of thousands of times a year.
Yeah, 100. As I said, there are 100 wells being fracked a day. So, it will take a couple weeks to assemble the rig. The rig is what people think about, it's the big derrick, and to drill the well and put the pipe in and secure the pipe. And then all that clears off. And then you bring in just hundreds of pieces of equipment that all have to be set up, frack, assemble, frack, disassemble, repeat the next place.
And can you talk a little bit about the history? I mean, people sort of think there's this new thing happening. And the great thing about the book is industry will tell you there's nothing new about this. Right. You've been fracking for 70 years. And
I disagree with both of them, right?
And you show there is a long history to this, and I want you to talk about it, but also talk about what's different, right? It is 3
stages, right? You can sort of think about the history of oil and gas. The world's first frack job, I contend, happens about 1867. So this is right after the Civil War. And in fact, the history of this goes back to the Civil War. So there's this guy, Edward Roberts, who is sort of a tinkerer. He invents a new way to make dentures or the what is it, plastic or something. It wasn't plastic, but the plates that you put the dentures into. He creates a new way to make some money. And he's recruited, and he becomes a lieutenant colonel and assembles a infantry to go fight in the Civil War. So he's stationed outside of Washington, and one day he has a little too much to drink, and he has to go on dress parade, and he's obviously drunk during dress parade. So he's brought up on a court-martial. But court-martials take time to go through, and there's a war to be fought. So they said, well, while we're court-martialing you, you still have to lead your group. And they sent him off to Fredericksburg for the Battle of Fredericksburg, which was not a great battle for the Union. Basically, the Union were charged to march through Fredericksburg and then up to where the Confederates were. And the Confederates had the high position and were just raining shells down on the Union positions. So Roberts is sitting there, and he's trapped down there in the town of Fredericksburg. And he's noticing that when the shells come down, they explode a certain way. But when they land in this trench, or ditch basically, with water in it, and they land underwater, the explosion goes in a different way, because the weight of the water was tamping down the explosion and forcing it out. So how he had the wherewithal in the middle of being bombed and shelled to figure this out, I'm not sure, but that's what he does. And so after the Battle of Fredericksburg, he survives. He tenders his resignation. He basically says, I'm not fit to lead men in battle, and the Union agrees. And so they court-martial him, and he decides that the next thing he's going to do is take this idea of how shells explode, and he builds what he calls a torpedo. It's basically a small little bomb with nitroglycerin. And he goes out to western Pennsylvania, where they've just made the great Drake discovery, and the oil age is beginning. And he spends a few months trying to convince people to let him put his bomb down at the bottom of the well. And of course, no one really wants to because it's completely untested. But finally, there's a couple of people who have very bad wells, and they say, "Well, it can't hurt." So he puts the bomb at the bottom of the well, and it's got like a little fishing line. And he's going to drop a weight on it, and he puts water over it, and then you drop the weight, and it goes down the line, and it causes the explosion. You pull up the water, you pull up the bomb, and lo and behold, it works. Because what it does is that you can drill a well, and you can come yay far from an oil seam, and it's a dry well, and you're completely broke. But if you drill a well and you cause a little explosion, you're going to send out fingers in each direction. And maybe you're going to hit an oil seam that way. And if you hit an oil seam, the oil will flow into it. And so well after well after well, he starts doing this. And not every well, but almost every well is better after you have done the Roberts torpedo treatment. And it's so successful, he patents it. He hires the Pinkerton Detective Agency because other people are trying to off-patent, come up with their own torpedoes. So he hires the Pinkertons to basically chase everyone down. There becomes a lucrative trade to do this at night when the Pinkertons can't find you. And they were said to light it off under the light of the moon, which is where the word moonlighting comes from. Because this was they would actually be doing this professionally during the day, but then they have a second job at night. And he dies one of the richest people in the United States, just makes lots and lots of money. So that's really where fracturing, and when I was researching this, I thought to myself, well, this isn't really fracturing. This is more like blowing things up. But if you look at his patent, it actually says the purpose of this invention is to create fractures in the rock. So I give him credit for it. But this is really where the industry has long had this love affair with trying to break, smash, blow up, incinerate, drop nuclear bombs in the middle of this rock to try to open it up. And this is really where it begins. But then that process is basically forgotten because then we find the Texas oil fields and the California oil fields. And those oil fields are so big and prolific that you don't need to fracture anything. That the oil is just coming up. You just need to sink the well and then hope, you don't have too much of a gusher. And that's, 1901 or so. And so basically fracking is forgotten. And then right about World War II, coming into 1940s, those great gushers, the elephants is what they were called, hunted to extinction. There are not many gushers left in the United States. And so the industry turns again to saying, okay, how can we can drill these wells, how can we establish our dominion over this rock? How can we force the rock to give up the oil and gas? And at the same time, some of the bigger oil and gas companies, the descendants of the Standard Oil Trust, are building research facilities. For the first time, oil industry has ever done this, R&D facilities, hiring PhDs who understand something about the rocks. And one of them is Stanolin, which is the old Standard Oil of Indiana. Stanolin has a research facility in Tulsa. And the guys in Tulsa start wondering, they've noticed something. They actually were working on cementing, making a better cement. And they noticed sometimes when they put cement in a well, they would lose some volume. And there was a correlation between how deep the well was and how much they lost. And they realized that the weight of the cement that they were putting in was fracturing the rock. So they said, oh, that's interesting. What if we tried to do this, but without cement, so we could get it out? Because once you put cement in, you can't get it out. And so they were the first people to devise and patent this idea of the hydrofrack, 1947. And we, as a country, as an industry, they start fracking everything. Well, 50,000, 100,000 wells are fracked. It's licensed to the Halliburton Oil Well, Halliburton Oil Well Construction Company. I forget what it's called, but Halliburton was involved from the get-go. And that was the first licensee of it. Lots of wells are fracked. In fact, but this isn't what we would consider a modern frack. This is small amounts of water, small pressure. And ultimately, in 1998, you have a young completion engineer who's working north of Fort Worth in the Barnett Shale. And this has been drilled by George Mitchell Energy, for years. And they notice each time they drill a particularly deep well that they go through this one section of rock called the Barnett Shale, and their instruments show gas. They give you basically a sniffer. You can detect where there's oil and gas. There's a gas show here. Okay, well, it's shale. We can't get it out. Shale is this incredibly dense rock. And so George Mitchell is a very stubborn man, and many, many things. He's very unusual. He's a liberal oil man from Houston. He fell under the sway of Buckminster Fuller and became to believe in spaceship Earth, and he had 10 kids and was worried that he was overpopulating the world. I mean, this is sort of a fascinating character. We can get into him. But he says, look, let's figure out a way to open up this shale. Let's figure out a way to complete a well into this shale to see if we can get the gas out. So for 16 years, between 1982 and 1998, a couple wells a year, 2, 3, 4 wells a year, all unsuccessful. And you have this young completion engineer who's hanging out in Fort Worth and knows that some of his friends who are working on this other kind of rock, sandstone, are experimenting with some bigger fracks, more water. And he said, well, maybe I could do that with shale too. And one of his coworkers said he'd eat his diploma if it worked. Didn't get a lot of support from management, except for George Mitchell. George Mitchell was fine, anything, but the people underneath George were always trying to control him and say, no, you're spending too much money. So he gets permission to do 3 wells to try to frack the shale. And all 3 of them mess up. They uses too much sand. He clogs up the well with sand. It's called screening it over. He goes back, gets permission to do 3 more wells. The 4th one he screens over. So he's running out of time with this new idea. The 5th one he does, he gets just the right mixture of sand, and he puts in more water under more pressure than anyone's ever attempted before. And the well takes it. And they pull the water back, and it just the gas comes screaming out of the well. It is the best well they've ever done. And it just, the scales have fallen from their eyes. They realize now that they can get gas out of the shale. And that's critically important because shales are the source rock. They are the kitchen where heat and pressure have created all this oil and gas. I mean, all the oil and gas in the world that we get have started off with shales and have just sort of migrated up over the years and been trapped in a reservoir rock. Maybe there's salt or there's some impermeable rock over and they collect there, and that's what we've been hunting for. Now we're going to the beginning. Now we're going to where the oil and gas was created, where the little microorganisms died and got covered up and cooked, in the kitchen for millennia. And that's really, so there's this big debate. You referenced this before, and you're absolutely right. The fractivists, the anti-fracking folks will say, oh no, this is an untested technology. We've only been doing it for a few years. It's not to be trusted. And the industry actually sent out a happy 65th, you probably got one, a happy 65th anniversary email like 2 weeks ago.
After the Terry the Friendly Frackosaurus coloring book.
That was it was a few years after that. But happy 65th anniversary because it's 65. Well, it's not really 65 years old. Modern fracking is about 98. What is that? It's now 16 years old. And we still don't, the industry won't tell you this, but we still don't really know what we're doing. We still don't fully understand how it works, but it works.
That was really interesting. It's good to see you are using your history degree. It was a really fascinating
those
history.
4 years.
No. And I'd love to hear more about George Mitchell and Aubrey McClendon, too, both of whom you spend a lot of time on in the book. But I'm cognizant of time, too, so maybe we'll open it to questions.
Sure.
If it works, you can weave them in. We have a microphone there, so if people could just identify themselves and please ask a brief question. Right here.
I'm wondering, because I know, what do we do about those who already have collateral damage? I have a letter here which I'll give you from a farmer, and that was 2 years ago, really, and now things are even worse, and they never drilled on her property, and she's only an example. So what is the industry doing for those whose land and aquifers have been impounded, who have become sick?
And right now, the industry is not doing it. The industry is fighting, by and large, will be fighting to try to get them, landowners, to prove that what they did really affected it. And that's one reason why I say you need to do baseline water and air testing, because otherwise you're just going to end up with exactly situations like this. She did baseline water testing and was able to prove that, well, Pennsylvania right now has a rule that basically says if the water has been tested and the aquifer changes within, I forget the exact number of feet, I believe it's 2,500 feet of a well, the presumption is that well caused it. And that's sort of a new rule that they're working with right now. So you don't even have to prove the exact pathway. That is the presumption. So, more rules like that basically will force the industry to build better wells, and then when something goes wrong, to fix the problem as best it can. I personally think that if you spend more time testing the wells once they've been drilled to show that they are solid, and that they're not going to allow migration, that will go a huge distance to preventing problems like this and methane migration, which is really what we're talking about.
Other questions? Yeah, please.
But just to add one quick thing, if you have bad actors, if you have companies like this, then they should, then they should be sued and they should be forced to pay a price. I mean, there's, if someone's not drilling a well, they're cutting corners, then they should be regulated, and and if they can't fix the problems, then they shouldn't be allowed to keep drilling. And this is not a right, it's a privilege.
Do the companies typically collect baseline data just to protect themselves but not make it public, or they don't want to know?
Some do.
They
Some do, but that's not, this has to be public. It has to be a
I
third
understand.
party. Yeah.
I just want to know if someone's collecting it.
Okay, Mark Rodovin, I'm at Columbia doing graduate work in sustainability.
Yes.
The question for you is, I think, a philosophical question. The U.S., I believe, is expected to become a net exporter of natural gas in a few years' time. So as we think about that, how do we reconcile that with producing additional gas that's actually for export?
Right.
So in fact, the importer is exporting the GHG associated with production. So that's my question.
So I just want to make sure. So your point is that if we are drilling more for export, then the greenhouse gases are being exported because of the burner tip issues? Is that not quite?
Sorry. So effectively, if we're producing for export,
Yes.
okay, whoever's importing it is getting the gas without the GHG
Right.
associated with the production, the upstream, okay? So if we're full up, let's say we're net export 0, everybody's happy in theory. We're producing gas, it has beneficial environmental effects. But if we're now exporting, let's say if New York jumps into the game, this is really the question, really. If New York jumps into the game, but in effect, everything New York produces is really exported.
Sure.
How do we think about that? Because do we say to everybody in New York, by the way, everything we're doing here, it's actually for export. How do we get our head around that? Because it's a different way of looking at it.
The way I think about exports is that they are one of the options available to the United States. We can do more export. We are a big exporter. I mean, we're going to become a large exporter already. The amount of export terminals that have been licensed, that they all get built, we're going to be the second largest exporter in the world behind Qatar. So the discussion really isn't should we be an exporter or not. The discussion more is should we be the world's largest exporter or the number 2 exporter, which is sort of really what we're looking at. Natural gas is a very efficient fuel. It is a very good fuel that is very efficient. So if we are using fossil fuels in this world, I think it makes sense to use more natural gas versus other forms of fossil fuel. So whether that's used here or for export, I'm a little agnostic on that. I think the more interesting question that the U.S. needs to be asking itself is, do we want to support an export trade because there's certain geopolitical benefits for that? Do we want to support oil and gas? Do we want to support manufacturing and petrochemicals? Because there are obviously some benefits for that. What about let's take all the trains and trucks and start running them on natural gas versus oil. There are benefits to that as well. There are a lot of different possibilities we face here. So the real question is, well, what do we do with it? And I think, one of the other questions I get a lot is, well, what about renewables? Is it hurting renewables? Well, 2012, was one of the lowest, 2013, one of the lowest prices of gas in years. And solar had an incredible year. I mean, just blew the doors off in terms of growth. So gas doesn't necessarily hurt the growth of solar and wind. And in fact, there are certain ways it could help the growth of gas and wind in terms of balancing the intermittent resource. So do we want to use our gas for that? That's not a conversation we're having right now. We're not asking ourselves, how do we want to use this and how can we use this? That to me is the most important question right now. And I think we're getting bogged down in a lot of other arguments about this that to me aren't as meaningful and potentially as beneficial as having that argument. But, I can't force Congress to do anything.
You talk a lot about Carl Pope in here, and I debated him on NPR for a full hour.
I was your intro,
export.
remember?
Yeah, it was pretty interesting. It was a fun discussion. Yes. So it's a huge issue. A lot of people are talking about. Yeah, please.
I'll go without My name is David, and I do a lot of investment in sub-Saharan Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And I've recently come across a couple of projects in North Dakota that I'm looking at from a similar kind of developmental standpoint. Is there any interesting or unusual kind of blue jeans to the North Dakota gold rush in the fracking industry or in the oil and gas industry? Are there? You mentioned the guys that are long hair and.
Is there special pants they wear? Is that what you're asking?
No. Are there any, let's say, ancillary services that will be growing dramatically? Like, for example, the North Dakotan banking industry, right? Could be a huge play. Right, hotels, restaurants, fuel.
Yes, all of that. I mean, if you spend time in North Dakota, it's kind of insane right now, especially Western North Dakota. I mean, only 500,000 people in the entire state. I mean, that's like a neighborhood here in New York City. They've had to import tons and tons of stuff. I mean, there's some, I'm not an investment advisor. I think I'm supposed to say that. But I would caution, I get asked this a lot, and I always caution people to say, a lot of those opportunities have occurred already. And there's been a lot of investment in North Dakota, for good and for ill. So just be careful. There might be some opportunities left. If I did that, I would be, a hedge fund manager right now and not talking to you.
The next Wisconsin sand mine or something.
Yes, exactly. Well, there's some, I spent earlier this year, there's some knock-on effects, the Bakken, North Dakota shale, grew so quickly, they didn't have any place to put it. They didn't have the pipeline. So they suddenly realized, well, we could put this on trains. Well, where did the trains go? As it turned out, a lot of it goes, 300,000 barrels worth go to Philadelphia. A lot of it comes right down the Hudson. That way, there we go. A couple 100,000 barrels a day, I think it was, coming down the Hudson, which no one had pointed out until we started pulling some Department of Environmental Conservation records. And it kind of, so one of the things we did is showed that the railroad industry, for instance, was not prepared for this. The fuel from the crude oil from the Bakken is much more explosive and combustible than many other types, and that's a problem because the tank cars weren't really up for it. And one of the things that's been very disheartening is then, well, how you begin to ask and look around, well, how many rail inspectors are there per state? Very, very few. I think there was one in Minnesota. Minnesota has become a huge thorough transit point for these oil trains. This is a choice we've made. We do not, as a country, like taxation. We do not like to support government services. But there are certain government services in the time of an oil boom that seems to be eminently reasonable.
Yeah.
Given that the public ownership of mineral rights is unlikely to change in the rest of the world, what sort of incentives could the United States promote in order to promote gas or shale development in places like Poland and Ukraine, which has enormous geopolitical?
It's a great question. It's been very difficult. I've been fascinated by some of the discussions about creating sovereign wealth funds to use some of this. Norway, for instance, has a sovereign wealth fund funded by the offshore drilling there. Well, the UK is now talking about that. And so a sovereign wealth fund is basically the government creating a large pool of money. Alaska has this, and then you either Alaska hands out checks to all its residents, or you can do things like, well, we can fund inspectors, we can fund the arts, we can fund social services. I mean, in Poland, you could be talking about a significant amount of money. So that's a possibility. That doesn't quite solve the problem of how do you incentivize the local communities, but maybe the answer is, well, we create a sovereign wealth fund and a disproportionate amount goes to impacted communities. Pennsylvania collected, I just saw this, $225 million last year, or no, excuse me, it's expected to collect $225 million this year from oil and gas drilling fees. And it's going to be 10% of it's going to the state to fund, hopefully it will pass through regulators and other people. And then of the rest, it's a 60-40 split, 60% going to impacted communities, 40% just statewide.
Other questions? Yeah, in the back.
For first year MPA students in C-class studying energy, also students of Professor Bordoff. My question is, you talked about the economic and environmental benefits of the boom. So my question was,
For a live stream audience.
yeah, okay. So my question, you talk about the economic and environmental benefits of the boom. So I also want to hear about your opinion on the political implication of the boom, like for the international affairs or foreign policies of the U.S.
Well, that's the discussion going on right now. You know, when you see Russia, I'm not even sure what the polite word is, take over the command. The question becomes, well, can the United States use this energy wealth to exert its influence? I think one of the real benefits is, people always talk about energy independence. Well, I don't think the United States is going to become independent in the sense that it will stop importing oil, nor should it. But when you import less, you become less dependent on any one supplier. You have more options. You know, you can talk to us. In the past, there were certain suppliers out there, we imported so much oil, we absolutely needed to stay friendly with, because otherwise there would be catastrophic political implications. Well, we are importing less, and we can now balance our imports more. We become less dependent on any one country. That's a potentially very strong benefit politically. Your question gets more towards, can we use this to exert our influence overseas? I don't see an answer to that yet. There are certain hurdles. It takes a long time to build a natural gas export infrastructure, and it's so costly that you basically have to tie up your exports and promise them to specific places. So the first gas export facility that's going to be built in the United States, I believe, is fully committed to Korea or Japan. So how does that help Europe vis-a-vis Russia? Well, there's some benefit, but it's a question, frankly, that is being resolved right now. And I think clearly there are some political benefits to it, but it's not clear exactly how that will work right now.
Over here. And
Sorry, just if you could wait for the mic just so our live stream audience can hear, that'd be great.
Hi, Tracy Austin. I'm with Mitsubishi Corporation. And my question is about regulations. When I came in, you were saying the one thing that will kill the boom is weak regulations. And so I was surprised to hear you say that. And I think I tend to agree with that. But from your perspective, what types of regulations are needed to be strengthened?
What I meant by that was that the social license to drill, the permission to go and drill, at this point is hanging by a couple of strands. It is not very secure, and the industry, I think, recognizes that. If you look at a place like Colorado, where 4 different cities, and not just Boulder, but Fort Collins, Broomfield, and I think Aurora, I can't remember the 4th, all voted to ban fracking. They're clearly, and you look at national polls, national polling is anti-fracking. So the industry has a real uphill battle. I think that I believe in 12 months, 24 months, there will be more regulation, and the industry will actually bring some of that regulation in, because this is a situation where if you have a small operator, I mean, if you're a Shell or a Chevron or an Exxon, and you have a small operator that has a major problem, and all of a sudden you have an aquifer that's in big trouble, everyone is going to be shut down. The government's not going to have the ability to distinguish between a good operator and a bad operator. It's going to be Deepwater Horizon all over again, shut down the Gulf of Mexico. And so I think you're going to have more regulations because there is a fear growing in the industry for that. Why does it need to happen? Well, I think it's common sense. We have had a rapidly developing industry. It's not like a traditional industry in that it sits in one place. It moves around. And it makes sense in a situation like that, where you're literally building a mini factory for 2 weeks and then putting it somewhere else, that you need to have strong regulations. Because it's inherently more difficult when you build a factory every 2 weeks and then disassemble it and build it again to make sure that factory is running smoothly. The industry, by and large, does a good job. Someone looking over their shoulder is probably not the worst thing.
I want to give you a chance to tell another good story, and then we'll take a final question if there is one. I just did some quick math. You spend 1/5 of the book talking about Aubrey McClendon. Why? Who is he, and why is he so important?
So Aubrey McClendon he was born and raised in Oklahoma City. sort of the child of his great uncle was a governor and a senator, and other members of the family founded the Penn Central Bank, which was, excuse me, the Penn Square Bank, which was, this is a very important bank. Someone's chuckling there because they know they know where that story ends up, just bringing down the economy in the 1980s. He goes off to Duke and comes back in 1981, and Oklahoma City is just going full guns. Oil is really expensive, Cadillacs everywhere. They're building new buildings, and within a year, you have the oil bust, and Oklahoma City is just knocked on its backside. The Penn Square Bank had made too many loans without good paperwork, and then had shared those loans, or I forget the exact phrase, but basically had sold off those loans to other banks around the country, and you just had a series of banks collapsing, including one in Chicago. It was like the 7th largest in the country, I believe. This is sort of the boom and bust world that he came from. And he looks at that and says, looks interesting, looks exciting. And he becomes what's called a landman. He is not an engineer, he's not a scientist. What he does is he goes to people's homes and says, I've got a deal for you. I'd like to sign up your mineral rights. He's a salesman, basically. He's an oil and gas salesman. And he's really good at it. He is very, very good at it. And he goes around, and he eventually meets this other guy who's doing the same, and they form a partnership, and he starts building up little bits and pieces, and they get bigger and better. And before long, they create this company called Chesapeake. And Aubrey McClendon's great genius is that he knows how to raise money, and he knows how to lease land. And he's incredibly good at that. So by the time, so he almost bankrupted the company 2 times, but by the early 2000s, he had a real bad gamble, lost a couple $1 billion in Louisiana, not at the riverboats, but on leasing land that turned out not to be worth anything. And he tries to sell the company. No one will buy it because there's no real value in it. And then he realizes before anyone else that this shale thing is transformative. So he gets credit. He picks it up. He doesn't have any of the technological breakthroughs, but he realizes just how big this could get. And he goes off and sells Wall Street on it. He convinces Wall Street to give him money, and he's doing secondary stock offerings and debt, and he starts leasing and leasing. And this is a company that when I started covering the industry in 2003, wasn't even on my radar screen, and I was supposed to be covering companies like this. No one had ever heard of Chesapeake. By 2008, he's drilling more wells than any other company in the world. And he is just, when you talk to other CEOs at the time, they say, well, we were planning to do this slow, orderly development. And then Aubrey came along, and we were going 40 miles an hour. And we thought we were moving as fast as we can. And he goes flying by in a race car at 80 or 90 miles an hour. And we needed to keep up. Because if we didn't keep up with him, if we didn't lease the land, he was going to lease it right from under us. And the way it works is once you lease the land, you've got a ticking clock. You've got 3 or 5 years to drill a well, or else you have to give it up. So then they had to start drilling. And so the whole reason this seemingly comes out of nowhere, this shale revolution, and all of a sudden people are talking about it and there are wells everywhere, is because Aubrey McClendon set the speedometer so high, and everyone was sort of caught in his slipstream. So he gets credit for realizing how transformative this was, for pushing it. He gets some credit for the fact that the United States' carbon emissions are down 12%. But he also gets credit for pushing things really quickly. And when I said earlier, we're just now asking the questions, methane leakage, et cetera, I think one of the reasons we've drilled so many wells before we started asking those questions is that everyone involved was trying to keep up with Aubrey. And, Aubrey, he's sort of famous for his appetites. He wanted more. Everything was more. It wasn't enough just to have a little bit. He didn't just want to have 100,000 acres. He needed 15 million acres under lease. He didn't just want to build a company. He wanted to build the next great Exxon. He didn't just want to have a couple of good bottles of wine in his cellar. He wanted to have a world-class collection of wine. And when he lost all his money, the list of wine he had to put up ran to 70 pages, I believe. He didn't just he sort of gets, the story was that he was with his wife in Michigan, and he sees this land on the lake that's undeveloped, and before long he's bought dozens of acres, and he's in a land zoning use fight with the locals because he wants to develop. I mean, I don't know, he seems to have figured out how to cram 36 hours into the day. I mean, he did so much in such a short period of time. It's really rather remarkable. But, his appetite, his want more and more, ultimately brought him down. He had this little side deal where he got this 2.5% slice of every well. that Chesapeake drilled, which was fine when they were drilling 10 wells. You know, it's a great way to incentivize your CEO. When you're drilling thousands of wells, and Auburn Buchanan literally has to go borrow $500 million to pay for that, to pay for his little 2.5% slice, things get into trouble. And that's what brought him down, because he's borrowing money from hedge funds that are, you know, and investment banks that he's then selling assets to as CEO of Chesapeake. And the board of directors didn't know what's going on, and it, you know, it all falls apart. They fire him, get rid of him. Termination with cause, I believe, is the technical term. And so he disappears for all of 3 or 4 months, pops up again, and is building up a new company that, by all, you know, he seems to be doing it again. So he's one of the most interesting, you know, outside of Steve Jobs, I would put him out as the second most interesting businessman to emerge of the last 10 or 20 years in the United States.
Fascinating. Well, this has been a really interesting conversation. Hopefully, you all knew of Russ's work beforehand, but if you didn't, now you know even more why you should follow him on Twitter, read what he writes in the Wall Street Journal, even if you don't always agree with their editorial page, and why you should buy this book, because there is a boom going on, and it's what is going to have huge impacts on the U.S. Energy future. And if you want to understand what the impacts are, what the debate is all about, where this all comes from, and what the history is, and do it in a really entertaining way, I think it's a great book. So I'm glad you were here. Thanks for sharing it with us, and please join me in thanking Russell Gold.